Soundstripe.
Hello and welcome to the first episode of Demystifying Politics. This podcast will allow us to break down the topics of the week and explain them in more simple terms for young people getting interested in politics. It'll also give you tips on how you can get involved in your local politics and really just help you access it and access politics, because we believe that everyone should be able to have a say no matter their age. Yeah, and so the topics we will talk about today, the three topics in the news. We'll talk about the Suez Canal crisis, what it is, what's happening there. We'll talk about the policing bill, why there's been so many violent protests, what's the big deal about it. And lastly, we'll talk about
shootings that have been
the shootings in America that have been happening, and gun reform in America, and why what's been going on there. So let's start off with the Suez Canal. So Nathan, well, do you want to start us off?
Okay, so earlier this week, many of you would have heard that a boat got stuck going down the Suez Canal. So it was actually strong winds led to the captain being unable to steer the boat forwards, and therefore it's lodged in the side of the Suez Canal. So why is this so significant? Well, about 12% of all global trade goes through the Suez Canal, and it's vital in terms of reducing the cost of travel between Asia and Europe, because otherwise you have to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope at the South in South Africa. So this is very important in terms of global trade.
Exactly. Also, there's just some facts for you guys before we break it down. According to data from Lloyd's List, the blockage is holding up an estimated 9.6 to 7 billion pounds of goods each day, which is about $400 million an hour, and that Egypt is losing about $40 million in revenue every day that the canal is closed. So basically, exactly as Nathan explained, the reason this canal is so significant is because it provides, if you think about the map of the world, it provides an easy access route through Africa and into Europe, as opposed to going, as you talked about, the Cape of Good Hope down and through South Africa, which takes a lot more time. So and I actually thought this was very interesting, because to me, it's why it signals to me that actually that our supply chains, i.e., supply chains are basically the things that provide you the products you see in your everyday supermarket. So strawberries, drinks, bananas, whatnot, they all come through some sort of supply chains, and that is obviously in the news because of PPE and COVID. So it shows how fragile our supply chains actually are, and our goods and trading services, and actually that free trade isn't as invincible as people think. So it's an interesting, it's actually quite interesting. If you look at it on the surface, obviously it's a very funny story to most people, especially people on Twitter, that, oh, look, a boat getting stuck is just halted global trade. But actually, if you look deeper, there's more like meaningful consequences about it. Like, it talks about it, how secure is free trade, how secure are supply chains. Could this say something that happened more serious, like a complete blockage of the Suez Canal? Could that mean that goods would take much longer? Like, how secure is free trade?
I think this whole episode has really demonstrated to us that countries need to be moving more towards self-sufficiency. And I'm not saying we can't import things from other countries, because obviously, if you're in Britain, there are some fruits that just don't grow here, and there's some things we just need to import. But we need to stop believing that we can just trade our way into prosperity. We do need to build things here. And that's why I think that measures that sort of abandon the manufacturing movement here in the country are so detrimental, because what if things like these happen? This happened.
Exactly. And just to explain to those who don't quite understand. So basically, when we talk about free trade, so in the past, so for I would say the majority of human history, countries have relied on self-sufficiency, as Nathan said, i.e., basically you create your own goods and you sell it in your own country. in the 1800s, when Adam Smith came out with his book on Intellectual Book of Capitals on capitalism, and the ideas of free trade began to come in, and that has probably dominated economic thought for the last, I would say, since the 1800s to now. That free trade is unquestionably a good thing. Now, what free trade means basically is that, say, another country is really good at producing pineapples or a wine or cars, like Germany or France or whatever, you will buy the goods from France, right? Or Germany or whatever, as opposed to creating it in your own country. So that means, yes, you will get cheaper goods, and that is better for consumers. Because obviously, if something's made cheaper in another country, it's better for you because the prices are lower. But it also means that traditional manufacturing jobs that were in your own country, i.e., building plants, sorry, building cars, building goods, building, whatever, those jobs are taken away. And which is exactly what Nathan alluded to, that, perhaps this episode mean that we start looking at self-sufficiency a bit more.
Yeah, so free trade sort of thought really re-emerged in Britain and the world in the late 1970s, early 1980s with the Thatcher-Reagan neoliberalism revolution. And it's probably one of the more popular parts because obviously Thatcher popularizing austerity and crushing unions has been very unpopular. But free trade has been popular, which is why Clinton started NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, which created a free trade zone between the US, Mexico, and Canada. Then obviously within the EU, one of the world's largest blocs, you have free trade within those countries. That was very controversial when the UK decided to leave that. So I'm actually curious as to how public opinion of free trade will change after these events.
Yeah, I think this event, well, I'm not sure how many people it will sway, but I think what it will show is that, free trade isn't invincible. Now, with the public, I think it'll take. Um, I think there have been pushback on free trade now. If you see Trump ran anti-free trade, well, probably the first right winger to do so in, at least a century. Like, a right wing candidate running against free trade is almost unheard of. Then you had Bernie Sanders in the US as well, running on terms of trade. Obviously, in other things, definitely not. But on trade, virtually the same platform: anti-NAFTA, anti-free trade, and much of the Democratic parties now, apart from maybe Biden and some very other, and like Obama and a few others, the majority of the parties now, I would say, more protectionist than before. So yeah, I think that the free trade pushback is already happened, and this can just further exacerbate it, perhaps. My personal view on free trade is that I think it is a good thing, but I just think I think it should be unbridled. Like, i.e., I think, yes, some a modicum of self-sufficiency is necessary, and I also think that what we need to do is a better job of helping out those people who've lost their jobs. So in the north, after Thatcher introduced her free trade policy, they were just left to dry. Whereas what she could have done is, invested heavily in the north, invested in social services, invested in infrastructure to try and help those very people out. We also need to look at environmental concerns, trade union concerns, and have all these people at the table, as opposed to, I think, at the moment, when it comes to free trade, it's just the government of that country, a few businessmen deciding free trade. I don't think that's the way to go.
Yeah, so it's actually very interesting that you brought up the example of Bernie Sanders and the Democrats. A while ago, I was looking at Elizabeth Warren's platform for when she was running for president, and with a few exceptions, her opening speech on trade, could be mistaken for Donald Trump's. Talks about things like trade is here to benefit American workers and American families, which are obviously things that propelled Trump into winning in places like West Virginia, Michigan, back in 2016, obviously, Ohio. Yeah, so across the political spectrum, there's a pushback against this. Uh, what other political impacts do you think the Suez Canal will have?
Yeah, I think, apart from further leading to people mistrusting free trade more, I think it'll also, it's more of a look at globalization as a whole. So obviously, when we talk about globalization, what we mean is that over the past, I would say 40, 50 years, we've had a period known as globalization where the world become more interconnected, more together, more transparent. We are more interlocked with each other than ever. Um, uh, in terms of immigration, in terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of goods, in terms of everything, basically. And what I think is that this episode shows all it's going to do is all it does is highlight the failures of globalization. So I'm not going to okay. Just before I continue, I'm going to make it myself clear. I am pro globalization. I think generally it's a good thing that the world is more interconnected, but I'm not so naive as to not see the problems with it. So I think that there have been issues with immigrants assimilating, and I'm an immigrant myself. Like my parents were immigrants, so I'm not saying this as a place of it out of a place of hatred. What I'm saying is that we need to we need to do a better job of making sure immigrants assimilate into the UK. We can't have a situation, okay, where you're coming into the UK and then there's a lot of the time it's like segregation almost in some of these towns, like where there's like an Indian part of the town, there's a white part of the town, there's a Chinese part of the town. Like we can't have that in Britain. I think I know this is a pretty controversial thing when Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage, one of them said that like, in order to come to England, you should learn English. And that was pretty controversial at the time. I don't think that was particularly controversial. I think you should learn English when you come to the UK, only so you can better assimilate. Not because I just think immigrants are all dumb and dirty and going to ruin the country. I just think that it just if you learn English, it'll just be better for you to assimilate. So what I'm saying as a whole, therefore, is that the political impacts of the Suez Canal crisis, well, okay, on the surface, everyone's going to laugh, right? Oh, look at this boat just stopped global trade. Actually, if you look deeper, it has implications for free trade, for globalization, and you can see like the deeper trends behind it.
Yeah, I very much agree with your point about assimilation and immigration. Would you want to move on to the next topic?
Yep, I think we should. So yeah, that was good. Okay, so we'll talk about the next topic. So let me just introduce it. So the policing bill. So that's been on the news, I'd say, for a couple of weeks now, and then you had those violent protests in Bristol last night. So okay, what is the policing bill? So in response, so obviously let's look at Genesis 1. So Sarah Everard, this woman was abducted. She was on her way walking home. She was abducted by a Met police officer, who then proceeded to murder her. There may have been. I'm not sure if this is confirmed yet. So there may have allegedly been some sort of sexual assault. Meanwhile, or may have just been a murder. Again, I don't know. So I can't comment. But yeah, and then that uh, sparked a conversation about women's safety. Now, amidst that, the Conservative government saw an opportunity to push through a bill which they'd been waiting for a long time. So the government had always, the Conservative Party had always been looking for an opportunity in which to clamp down on some of the more extreme protests, which we've been seeing. So in 2019, we've seen Extinction Rebellion basically halt London to a grindstill, and at the time, Priti Patel and Boris Johnson and Theresa May and whatnot, they'd all been quite angry that they couldn't do more to stop it. So they saw this as the perfect opportunity to go through with it. Then, of course, you had the vigil for Sarah Everard, where the police came in. And it was in Clapham, I think. The police came in, they took people away. It was generally pretty rash and unnecessary from the police themselves, and it led to a backlash and people saying, you know what, at this time we shouldn't be giving more power to the police. So what does the bill actually do? So there's a good BBC article I saw on this. Probably does a better job than me. I'll just read it. So basically, what it'll do is, so police chiefs will be able to put more conditions on static protests. They'll be able to impose and start a finish time, set noise limits, and apply these rules to a demonstration by just one person. They will also become. It'll also. This is one of the more controversial parts. It'll also become a crime to fail to follow restrictions the protesters ought to have known about, even if they've not received a direct order from an officer. At present, police need to prove protesters knew they had been told to move on before they can be said to have broken the law. this proposed law includes an offence of intentionally or recklessly causing public nuisance. So basically, what they're saying is that police can now arrest you for breaking a law you ought to have known about, whereas before they had to have told you that that you shouldn't be doing this before. So and then there's other parts of the bill less known, but that's just basically more just typical conservative things. So changing sentencing rules so that serious criminals spend more time in jail. Judges will be allowed to consider jailing child murderers for their entire lives. Maximum sentences for low-level assaults against emergency service workers doubled to 2 years. On terrorism, the bill creates powers to more closely monitor offenders released from prison. Community centers for less serious crimes to address underlying problems in offenders' lives. Changes to sexual offences laws to attack abusive adults in position of trust, such as sports coaches or religious figures. So yeah, the bill as a whole is, if we look away from the specifics, is basically trying to clamp down, probably be a good word, on peaceful protest, and basically make it slightly harder to peacefully protest, and that is cause some controversy. Nathan, you want to talk some more?
So there are obviously some very uncontroversial parts of the bill. So one of the parts of the bill stipulated that the government is ordering an investigation into the sort of weapons that are used in homicides. Obviously, they want to increase sentencing for homicides for children, which might be controversial to some, but I don't think is really what's driving these protests in Bristol, for example. Now, the most controversial part of the bill, part 3 and 4, public order and unauthorized encampments. So what this does is, as you said, it amends police powers so that police can impose conditions on protests that are noisy enough to cause, in their words, intimidation or harassment, or serious unease, alarm, or distress. So we have this tradition in British law where we use words that are very vague and can be sort of interpreted either way. For example, who gets to decide what's a nuisance, who gets to decide what's annoying, which will definitely cause some controversy in the coming months when people are eventually arrested under these laws.
Yeah.
And another part is clauses 57 and 58 expand the controlled area around Parliament where certain protest activities are prohibited. So there's a zone around Parliament where certain protest activities cannot happen. And I think that is counterintuitive to the idea of protest. Surely, if you're protesting, you're usually protesting the government. You're usually calling on the government to either stop doing something or to start doing something. So I think it's kind of hypocritical that the government say protests should not harm everyday people doing living their everyday lives. Yet they've created a zone around their house, Parliament, where protests cannot happen. If anything, protests should be around Parliament and maybe should not be around more residential or more commercial areas.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you just said. I think the government kind of messed this part up a little bit on their part, because as we see, okay, so just to explain to some who might not know, generally the Conservative Party generally pushes for more tough sentences for those who are accused of a crime. That is generally the way it goes. And then Labour generally pushes for more rehabilitation programs. So not necessarily lesser sentences, but they don't really actively push for tougher sentences. So I think that, so the Conservative Party is always looking for an opportunity to put tougher sentences. So I think with the Sarah Everard thing, when it happened, and we later on, when it's a different episode, we can talk about women's safety and whatnot. They had an opportunity to basically push for more, and which would have gained wide support, probably even from most Labour Party people, for tougher sentences for criminals accused of violence against women. And then probably at the same time, they could have slipped in some of the more other stuff, like tougher sentences for homicides, child murderers, etc., etc. But because in that bill, they decided to do protests and tougher sentences at the same time, and then at the same time, you saw those scenes in Clapham where police were clearly, unnecessarily using unnecessary use of force. Then you had what ended up happening, which is this massive kill the bill protests everywhere, anarchy in the streets of Bristol, and exactly what you're saying, a massive pushback from more parts.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think this is a very good political move. I do not think that this current government has the political acumen to really, even if they wanted to achieve something that was very, they could say something like the sky is blue. They probably wouldn't be able to get that through without causing some controversy, because I don't think this government has the political acumen or experience to really achieve their aims. You can say what you want about someone like Farage, but he has accomplished everything that he has set out to accomplish. And that's without even holding a position as an MP for an extended period of time. He's pretty much been on the fringe for his entire 20-year career, and he still achieved his goal of getting Britain out of the European Union. Whereas Boris Johnson, who won a landslide election victory, uh, supposedly that's supposed to make things easier. It hasn't. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're totally right. With and that I think that what that'll do is just anger the conservative base more, because you're already seeing some parts of the conservative base. You're seeing, especially with some backbench MPs, already getting a bit fed up with so much COVID restriction laws. And I think this will just anger the base more, that hey, we came out, we turned out, we gave you 80 seats, but you're not even doing what you promised to do. So yeah, I think that's one part. That's the actual bill itself. I think another part we can discuss is also the violent, what you saw with the violence in Bristol, the violence you saw. I can't remember. There's another place where there's some pretty violent protests, but generally, I think it was last night. There was some pretty horrific scenes in Bristol, and where does how at what point does you know at one point can you violently protest no matter what the cause is? So and does that also mean then the government, it's the momentum shifts to the government side, that there's that the scenes of last night give the government reason to be like, yo, hey, look at this, look at all these like anarchist extremist communists raging about in the streets of Bristol, setting fire to things and trying to kill policemen. Look, that's look at them. Look, there's we actually need this bill to happen. And I think the problem with these protests is just shifting. It's giving the government the momentum that it sorely needs.
Yeah, I'm also interested in how this will. In fact, I don't think this will really affect public opinion of or the electability of the Conservative Party, because who are the people that are mainly protesting this? Young people. What is famously known about young people in politics? They don't vote. So, Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, now the Sarah Everard sort of movement, they're getting a lot of media attention, getting a lot of attention on social media. But will it come to fruition in 2024? I don't think so.
Yeah, yeah. I actually agree with that, and I think that's just to divulge just for a second before we move on to the last bit of my news. That's where you see Keir Starmer moving. Uh, that's why you can perhaps in that light see some of Keir Starmer's moves. That why is he moving towards now trying to pick up middle class liberal Democrat, sort of Remainer conservative votes in London, and kind of not abandon the North, but not like actively try to win it back, which is because that Jeremy Corbyn tried to get a working class coalition from the North and young people. And in 2017, it nearly worked. And in 2019, it didn't work because of Brexit. And so the youth earthquake that we were expecting 2 elections in a row didn't quite come. We saw 2017 was more the North that really gave Jeremy Corbyn his not victory, but not a loss either. But yeah, I think yeah. So do you have anything more to say on this topic before we move on to the gun violence?
No, I'm just interested to see whether they proceed with the bill, whether they amend it, or whether they just push through. Because
Yeah,
it seems every single week that there's something controversial that happens with a member of the cabinet. Obviously, this week, Priti Patel has just been exposed, I guess, for her liberal spending of public money.
yeah. I think that with Preeti, I think they will be able to push it through the House of Commons for sure. The bit where they might get a bit of trouble is in the House of Lords, but the House of Lords doesn't have that much power anyway. So if they really wanted to go for it, they could get it through, I reckon. But I there's so much pressure now. that I think Boris Johnson's so, you already see he's so reactive to public pressure that he more than likely U-turn.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the last bit of news. So this is about the gun shootings in America. So we've had in America, if you've not heard, there was one shooting in Colorado, Boulder, Colorado, I think, where a gunman went in to a supermarket and just killed dozens of people. And then there was another shooting. I'm not sure which state,
It was
but
in
what
Georgia,
I think, yeah,
wasn't
Georgia. Yeah, I think it was Georgia. But he basically, a gunman went to 6 or 7 beauty parlors, a bunch of beauty parlors, killed people, and a lot of them were Asian American women. The Georgia Asian American shooting that sparked a conversation about anti-Asian hate that's come out of COVID-19 generally, and sort of that that issue. And then Boulder, Colorado, that was just more of a horrific shooting again. And I think that's merged to generally, again, another gun control debate in the US that we all know how this, at this point, even someone, I'm like 15 and even I know how this goes now. The shooting happens. The NRA says, you know, uh, you know, prayers and blessings or whatever that thing, thoughts and prayers. The Democratic Party says now's the time for gun reform. There's a bit of pressure for like 1 or 2 weeks. They maybe like once in every 6 times, if it's a really bad shooting, try something that in some legislation fails, and then we all go back to our merry lives, no worrying about it. Um, so yeah, I mean, yeah, Nathan, what do you think about it?
So it's also very interesting to see what kind of political debates came out of each shooting. It's very unfortunate that we have to talk about the political impacts when so many people have unfortunately lost their lives. But that's how these things work. So when deaths are the results of political policy, you have to talk about political actors. So with the Georgia shooting, I noticed there wasn't much debate around the actual guns used themselves. So there definitely was some, but it tended to resolve around anti-Asian hate, anti-racism, that sort of vein. However, I noticed with the Colorado shooting, no respect was given to that. And it was immediately Biden came out and said, "We need to ban assault weapons. We can ban assault weapons." I thought that was very interesting to see.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. I think because the Boulder, Colorado shooting happened, I think it was in the same week. I'm pretty sure, but it happened slightly later. That meant that then the national debate in the U.S. at least shifted towards more like uh, gun control esque things. So exactly. So in the US, for those that don't know, they basically have something called the Second Amendment. So in the US, they have a constitution, which we don't have, which basically guarantees certain rights to every citizen of the US, regardless of their race, creed, religion, color, whatever. Although historically, it's obviously not been true. Um, so the First Amendment gives people rights to
Freedom of
free
speech,
speech,
freedom of
yeah,
religion, freedom of
freedom of
assembly,
religion, assembly, or
protest,
exactly
press.
protest, all the great things that one of the most revolutionary things I think written by government. Second was the right to own a gun, and I think third is like something about like British about like something the military not being able to like be in your
Yeah,
home.
some of it's definitely anachronistic. Some of it is very
Yeah,
specific to the
yeah,
late 18th century, which
yeah,
is
and
when the Bill of
yeah,
Rights was.
yeah.
The
The
Third
the
Amendment
more
is about no British soldiers, and you don't have to keep a soldier in your home.
Yeah,
Obviously,
exactly. It's a really weird one. That one. That one doesn't come up too often in U.S. public debate. The ones that the important ones about the first, the second, and there's a Bill of Rights. Then there's about the 13th Amendment, which I think, well, 13th or 14th. But one of them was, I think it was 13th was slavery. 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 19th
19th
Amendment gave the women the right to vote. 21st was like banned
repealed the prohibition.
repealed prohibition, and then the rest are just sort of like weird ones about like congressional term limits and Senate and all types of things. So yeah, so because in the US they have a constitutional right to own a gun, what they have is what it means that basically is that every time it's harder to restrict the supply of guns. So generally, the more guns you have, the more mass shootings you're gonna have. That's just how it works. So basically, in the US, because they have an inordinate amount of guns, because it's just culturally and historically just seen as significant to US history, they have loads of guns, which means that if someone's crazy in the UK, if someone's crazy because there's not guns are not very available, they'll I don't know, they'll take a knife and they'll try and kill maybe one or two people, but they won't have as big a reach as if you take an AR-14 and go to your local supermarket. Um, and basically, the Democratic Party generally proposes gun control. Um, I think I would say fringe parts of it. I wouldn't necessarily say mainstream parts of it. Fringe parts of it um, propose gun abolition, but that would never ever happen in the US.
Yeah,
Some
that would be too controversial to get through. Yeah.
impossible. Then there's other parts which sort of talk about gun buybacks, but generally the most basic bread and butter US democratic policy is universal background checks, um, AR assault rifle ban, high capacity magazine bans, and mental
Bump
health
stock bans.
yeah, exactly, domestic violence. So all those things. Um, and yeah, I mean, Nathan, do you have anything to say about?
So I want to talk about the relationship between the number of guns a society has and the number of homicide deaths it has. Because I think we often focus on the number of mass shootings, but I don't think that's very helpful. Because if people are aren't dying by mass shootings, but they're dying by other way, but they're being killed by other ways, I don't think it's a very useful conversation to have. And while it is true that the US has an abnormally high rate of homicides, considering it's a developed country, I I'm skeptical as to whether guns are the issue. So we can look at countries with the most gun with countries that have the most guns, and Serbia actually comes in second at around 70 guns per 100 people. The US is way ahead, about 130 guns per 100 people, but Serbia I think is very interesting. Serbia has quite a low homicide rate, very comparable to France, the UK, Germany, but it has loads of guns. So I think there are definitely cultural issues that need to be dealt with before we just do a blanket ban or restriction on the type of guns that could be owned.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about America, and particularly I think Democrats and Republicans. So I think Democrats at times are a bit naive. They say, "Oh, just do the five things we say: universal background checks, red flag, etc., etc." And all the gun, and we'll become every developed country in the world. We'll never have mass shootings again. That is just wrong. Okay, so yes, I agree with. Don't get me wrong. I agree with those proposals, but I I also know that that won't make as big a dent as they hope it would. They would probably cut, say, 10 or 15,000 deaths. So the US has gone homicide, which is a lot. That's 15,000 lives saved, but it won't make as narrow a dent as you do in order if you really want to make a dent. So I think if you wanted to make a dent, there's two ways you could go about it. Gun buyback schemes, which is what Australia did, which is what New Zealand does, the UK, whatever. But because of the US and their culture, because of the Second Amendment, because generally cultural reasons, gun buybacks would never happen because what you're essentially doing is taking away guns from citizens, which is basically their biggest fear. That's the NRA. That's their number one like fear mongering tactic. Like, oh, they're going to take away your guns. So I don't think a buyback. So either you do buyback, so you take away the pool of guns and therefore artificially depress the amount of mass shootings, or you could actually you could talk about cultural mental health issues, stuff like that. So actually, this is where NRA aren't completely wrong. People make fun of them for always talking about mental health, but they're not wrong, right? Mental health is the reason mass shootings happen. So the US doesn't have universal health care, of course. The US doesn't have, mental therapist sessions aren't free, etc., etc. So therefore, because of the lack of mental health infrastructure for people, loads more people fall to slip through the cracks. Whereas in a more developed country, you have this social safety net of you have your free healthcare, you have your therapist, your GP will makes you a therapist, and so you're better able to be treated. Whereas in the US, because it's there's a lot of gaps in the system, more people fall through. Therefore, more people are likely to take up guns and do the horrific things you see.
Yeah, I do think it's not a great look on the part of the Republicans to propose sort of no public healthcare policy and then turn around and say gun shootings are the result of mental health problems. Uh, you could probably gain a lot of political capital by proposing maybe not even universal healthcare, but definitely a way of subsidizing public healthcare in an effort to reduce gun problems.
Yeah, exactly. I think both sides talk about half the issue, and of course, as per normal, they don't quite get the full picture. And it's not always the case, but I think especially in this case, it's true. So the Democrats talk all about gun control, red flag laws, universal background checks, which are half the problem. And all the Republicans talk about, and they talk about this in a sort of superficial way. They never really, as you say, propose genuine policies that would affect this. But generally, they will talk about mental health and all that. Whereas if you had a combination of that and you had effective policies which genuinely targeted it, you say, okay, we'll have red flag laws, we'll have universal background checks, we'll try and make it harder, at least for those who have mental health issues, to get guns, but then at the same time pair that with mental health legislation, better is better funding for infrastructure not infrastructure, just mental health infrastructure, therapists, sessions, etc., etc., subsidizations. Then you could really get an effective hold on America's gun control problem without having to restrict the supply of guns, which I think in America is virtually impossible.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the news items of the week. Did you, Nathan, do you want to talk about the speed of vaccinations for a bit, just towards the end?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So when the first vaccinations were happening, maybe 2 months ago, there was a lot of talk about Britain is way ahead of Europe, way ahead of the rest of the world. But I don't think that's true anymore. So I'm on the government website right now, and Britain has delivered about 30 million vaccinations. That sounds great. Half of the population, more than half of the adult population vaccinated. Great. But what they're not telling you is that's just the number of people who have had one dose of the vaccine. And as we know, one dose of the vaccine isn't fully effective. So if we really want to, a better way of measuring it would be the number of people who are fully vaccinated. And when you look at it like that, it's much, much lower. Currently, only about 5% of the population have been fully vaccinated, which is far behind a lot of the countries that we are supposedly doing way better than. For example, the US, where they've got 15, close to 15% of their population.
Yeah, I think what's also I think the reason behind that is what the government has done, and I think this may come back to buy. So right now, I think they're still reaping the rewards from the vaccination program. You've splashed all over headlines, front pages. The UK is number one. We are the best, etc., etc. But the reason we're able to do these vaccinations so quickly and effectively is because we're giving people only one dose, and then you have to wait 12 weeks for your second dose. So what's happening is, as opposed to doing two, because you obviously need two doses, they're going one to everyone, and then hoping that we'll give one to the rest. But if we do it that way, it means, yeah, we'll give everyone their first dose really quickly, but we won't act, as Nathan said, get to that full immunity like other countries. So that sort of, I think it's because of the government generally, like Boris Johnson likes that flashy newspaper headline, that flashy that flashy bit of good PR saying the UK is number one. They've done a good job of vaccinations. They've done really well. And whereas the whole year they've been getting battered over generally their handling of the pandemic. But if it turns out, later on in the year, we see other countries opening up because a lot of people have had second doses. But actually, the UK, not everyone's had the second dose. It could start to fall onto the government.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a problem when we get to early June, when we're expecting maybe 90% or 80, 90% of the population to be vaccinated, but the number is actually closer to maybe 30%. And therefore, we have to delay reopening. I really hope this doesn't happen, but I'm not confident the government will achieve their 21st of June goal. Yeah, I'm
And
not confident.
And the real problem they've done with that is they've given people a specific date. And while that's great, everyone's hoping for that day. Everyone's got it marked on their calendars. They're getting their parties ready. They're getting their dresses ready, etc., etc., to go clubbing on the 21st of June. it does mean that that if or when, to more accurately, they have to delay the reopening, they're really gonna face the blowback from the public.
Yes, and I have no idea how, but Boris Johnson has maintained a pretty comfortable poll lead. I mean, he still has a negative approval rating, meaning there are more people that disapprove of him than approve of him. But considering that we've had more than 100,000 COVID deaths, I was really expecting this to be more. But currently, 45% of the public approve of him and 48% disapprove of him. If you look at social media or newspaper headlines, you would think that's a lot higher, but clearly not the case.
Yeah, and I think yeah, exactly. If you look at Twitter, you'd think Keir Starmer was like 40 points ahead, but that's Twitter's not the world. Um, and what you see from the Conservatives now, they've really got this now 40%. This stubborn, and this is not usual for US for British politics. Unlike in the US, where you see like stubborn voter base, like the Trump has about 30% of the country that's stubborn Trump. The Republican Party as a whole is about 45% of the country. The Democratic Party is about 47% of the country. And then you got like 6 or 7% of people who are disinterested, who often swing the election based on what they're feeling like. And basically what means is we're starting to see that happening in the UK because the Conservatives haven't dipped below that 40% number. They've got a stubborn 40% of the country that seems to be intent on voting for them come rain or come shine because when it was the worst of the pandemic, we are having 100,000 deaths when they're getting battered by most newspapers. They're maintaining their approval rating, and the base, almost in a Trumpian style, doesn't seem to care about policy, right? So in typical bases, if you go against what you promise in your manifesto, you lose popularity. Like Keir Starmer has gone against wasn't like he's gone harsher on Jeremy Corbyn than many expected, and so his approval rating with the Labour base has sort of gone down. But Boris Johnson is raising taxes. He's keeping restrictions. He's doing a lot of things that would normally enrage a conservative base, and he's not getting a dent because he seems to have this ability to just hold on to high approval ratings.
Yeah, I think what the cause of this is that there's no real major right-wing party that's a challenge to Conservatives. The Conservatives are famously the most successful political party since in the history of the world because they maintained a constant seat at the table of one of the world's greatest democracies since about the late 19th century. And right now, they have a 9 point lead ahead of Labour. A 9 point lead ahead of Labour.
Yeah.
They're at 43, it was at 34. Then you've got Greens at 7, Lib Dems at 5, and the SNP at 5.
Yeah, and I think with the Labour Party actually, there's more competition, and that forces Labour to be slightly more ideological in ways, um, because you got the Labour Party, you got the Green Party, you got the SNP, whereas before Labour would used to rule Scotland, Labour would rule the North, Labour basically ruled England. So there was basically Labour, the Conservatives, whereas now in London and South it has competition with Lib Dems and the Greens. In Scotland, it's now basically been wiped out by the SNP, which is another left-wing party, but just nationalist. Now in the north, you've seen this new Northern Independence Party, half joke, half real, that is springing up and getting a bit of momentum. So that might be a new party that's gonna punish Labour and split the vote further up there. And the only and you just don't see that equivalent for the right on the Conservative Party. All you've really seen is sometimes every now and again, whenever Farage wants something to get done, he creates a party, puts some pressure on the Conservatives, and they budge, right? So Farage thought that Boris Johnson wasn't hard Brexit enough, forms the Brexit Party, fields some candidates, hurrah, Brexit happens. So every time, but the problem with Farage is he doesn't want it to be a permanent thing. He doesn't keep it in there. It's now called for Reform UK or whatever, but it's now just an irrelevant party, probably polling at 1% or 0%. Um,
Yeah,
um,
they're at 3%. Yeah.
yeah, it doesn't have this constant hold. Therefore, the pressure is not constantly on the Conservatives. So now, because the Brexit Party, Reform UK, whatever, is now not really an entity, the Conservative Party can go back to what they're doing best, ditching their manifesto, raising taxes, keeping lockdown restrictions, doing things that Conservatives would not be happy with. And yeah, I think that's exactly the point you were touching on.
I really agree. Is that the end?
Yeah, I think thank you guys for tuning into our first episode. We'll film another one next week. You can get it on Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, wherever you want to do. Please follow us on Twitter or Instagram. See you guys.